Alex Higgins once threatened to have his snooker teammate gunned down in one of the most bitter feuds in sport. The Northern Irishman was a mercurial genius who won 4 Triple Crown events, including 1 World Championship. However, his struggles with addiction drove him towards chaos, and he once fell out of the window of his Manchester apartment. David Hendon uncovers Higgins' story and more in his gripping book, Pots of Gold: A History of Snooker. He lifts the lid on the sport's military roots, some of its central characters, and how the 1985 World Championships final captivated a nation. In this video, I'll tell you about the main themes in the book and give you my honest thoughts on it. Now, Higgins was loved by fans but drove the snooker establishment and administrators up the wall with his disdain for authority and his penchant for the explosive. You just never knew what would happen next with him. And when he first emerged in the 70s, he really dragged up the standards and he would just fly around the table, hammering in centuries in around 4 minutes, earning himself the nickname the Hurricane. He won his sole world championship in 1982, defeating the great Ray Reardon 1815. But at the height of his addiction to alcohol, he was a combustible character, and he once headbutted Paul Hatherall, the tournament director for the UK Championships, for which he was fined 12 grand and banned for 5 tournaments. He actually revealed the punishment live on Terry Wogan's show on the BBC, as you do. And I really love the depth of Hendon's research into Higgins, and he actually quotes one article from the legendary journalist Clive Everton. Clive said Alex had an imperious wish to get his own way. And when Hendon writes about Higgins, he also weaves in the media's accusations of drug use and womanizing, and I think this was something which really impacted and tarnished snooker's image, especially around the kind of 70s and the 80s. Now, although Higgins was a case of lightning in a bottle, his violent outbursts were very much in contrast to the monotone Steve Davis and the happy-go-lucky Dennis Taylor. Indeed, one of Higgins' most notorious moments came when he threatened to have Dennis Taylor shot. Higgins was playing for Northern Ireland under the team captain Dennis Taylor in the World Cup in 1990. Higgins lost the 2 frames he was scheduled to play in and then refused to leave the table when Taylor asked him to. The 2 traded hostilities, and Taylor really just stood firm and was adamant that his running order should be followed. Eventually, Northern Ireland fell 9-5 to Canada in the World Cup final, and Higgins said the next time Taylor entered Northern Ireland, he would have him shot. Undeterred, just a couple of weeks later, Taylor actually beat Higgins 5-2 at the Irish Masters, and I think that really just shows something about Dennis's mental strength and his professionalism and just really his level of focus when he's at the table. After all, Taylor was a huge star thanks to his Crucible win in 1985, which we'll get to in a moment. And if you are enjoying this video, please do feel free to subscribe. I've also recently released videos about Jude Bellingham, Carlos Alcaraz, and there's much more to come. So another thing Hendon covers is the birth of snooker, which emerged from the Devonshire Regiment of the British Army, who were in India in the 1800s. Gambling was always associated with snooker, and this continued into the 1900s, where snooker halls were full of quite shady characters and people trying to sell knockoff goods. And while the early 20th century saw Joe Davis dominate the sport and really shape the concept of break building, in 1968 the player Ray Edwards said that he had intentionally manipulated matches for television entertainment. He said it became like professional wrestling, well, probably without the fake tan and spandex, I think anyway. Of course, television drove snooker to the forefront of British culture in the 80s, and remember, this was at a time when the BBC and the ITV actually refused to pay for coverage of the Football League. 18 million people watched Taylor's unforgettable Crucible victory in 1985, and a big part of that and snooker's upward arc was the promoter Barry Hearn. He was a dynamite salesman with a restless work ethic, and there's a story which Hendon touches on where Hearn buys 17 snooker clubs for 630 grand, and they're all making $1 million a year later. And it would be remiss of Hendon not to talk about how Taylor snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in 1985 at the Crucible against Steve Davis. For me, this was just a seminal moment in modern British history. And throughout all of this, Hendon just captures how unassuming Davis was. Being boring was just what he was known for, and it was almost like he had a veil over his face. And I think Barry Hearn, who has always been quite an eccentric and vocal character, to say the very least, put it well when he said, "I was the mouth and Davis was the player." So in that 1985 final, Davis actually racked up a 7-0 lead, but Taylor kept his hopes alive and reduced the arrears to 9-7. By the time Taylor had really kept pace and brought it back to 17-all before the deciding frame, he and Trevor East were actually drinking brandy in the interval before the last frame. I mean, what a thing to do. And as Taylor seized his moment, potting with audacity and verve, Davis really faltered and missed the last black. This allowed Taylor to clear up for one of the most iconic Crucible victories of all time. Barry Hearn, who was firmly in Davis's corner, said this was the biggest kick in the nuts you could ever have. So although Hendon does cover the modern day stars of the sport, he only actually devotes a couple of pages to Ronnie O'Sullivan, which I thought was quite cool because, we already know quite a lot about him as it is. He writes how Ray Reardon gained 10 years of his life back for coaching O'Sullivan, and how he really taught Ronnie to love the struggle and love some of the more difficult and unpleasant sides of the sport. And this is something I definitely agree with, because I've always thought of Ronnie as a real magician, but I think sometimes when the chips are down, he kind of loses that level of fight and determination. Having said that, he's won 7 world titles, which is level at the top with the legendary Stephen Hendry. So you just wonder how much more Ronnie could have achieved if he did have that kind of dedication consistently over the last 30 years. I mean, it's not to take anything away, but it's incredible to think if he was that bit more determined, what else could he have done? Ronnie's obviously had some great battles with the gifted Australian Neil Robertson over the years, who actually told Hendon about queuing up at the job centre when he really didn't know what he was going to be able to do with his life. Another legend of the sport who Hendon covers is Mark Selby, the Leicester tactical monster with 4 Crucible titles to his name. I learned so much about Mark, like how his mother left when he was 8 and his father died when he was 16. So Selby actually dedicated his first World Championships win to the memory of his father, and said that throughout his career that level of grief has really driven him on. And this kind of thing, it really just makes me see Selby in a completely different light, because I think in some quarters he's seen as a bit of like a modern day Steve Davis, someone who maybe doesn't have a really loud personality, maybe someone who is quite stoic. And especially in the way he plays, there's a running joke in snooker that like the pack can be as bad as it gets, but Selby would just never give an inch and have it re-racked. So he's always been a massive fighter, someone who will just grind opponents to the point where they just can't take it anymore. And I remember I was watching, I think it was the UK Championship. Selby was saying, I don't know how much longer I can do this for. Because of the way that Selby can sometimes struggle to cope with the pressure and the pressure that it puts on his family and that kind of thing. So I think over the last year or two, although Selby has a reputation as being quite cold and closed off, he has really kind of opened up and come out of his shell, which I think is good for him and great for the sport as well, because, his style of play, while it isn't everyone's cup of tea, I really, really respect his safety play. He's one of the best defensive players I've ever seen, and he is a real icon of the sport and one of the greats. So I must say I did really enjoy this book, especially the context around the early birth of snooker in the army, especially how apparently Mary, Queen of Scots, was an early adopter of billiards as well, which I would have never guessed. He also covers the progression of snooker from around the 60s to the 70s, to where there was around 300 people crammed into smoky snooker halls. Hendon also talks about the darker underbelly of snooker, and where players would actually be doing heroin in the toilets of snooker halls. He also tells us about corruption in snooker and how the likes of Stephen Lee and Liang Wenbo were actually banned from the sport. And I think the greatest compliment that I can give this book is that Hendon's passion for the sport really shines through. It never becomes like a kind of chronological Wikipedia book, i.e., this happened, this happened, this happened. I learned a lot. And although it is a little bit of a whistle stop tour of the history of snooker, but never to the point where it becomes dull. So, as the World Snooker Championships gets underway over the next couple of days, I'd definitely recommend this to anyone, especially newcomers to the sport. I'm actually going to be at the World Snooker Championships on the first Monday, which I just cannot wait for. Get me in that crucible. Thanks so much for watching. As always, see you soon.